My name is Allegra Kirkland. I'm the politics director at Teen Vogue, and I'm thrilled to be here for this conversation on how we deal with climate doomerism. I'm joined by three phenomenal panelists. Kristy Drutman is the founder of Brown Girl Green and the co-founder of the Green Jobs Board. Isaias Hernandez is the founder of Queer Brown Vegan. And Alaina Wood is a sustainability scientist, climate communicator, and the founder of the wonderfully named Garbage Queen. So, Alaina, I hope to start with you. I've heard you say that you don't really encounter outright, climate deniers anymore. You're much more likely to meet people who fall more into this climate doomer camp, especially young people. So they basically think, it's too late to do anything about the climate crisis. So kind of a two-part question. One is when you notice this shift happening and what you think prompted it. And then two is, what are some of the harms associated with climate doomerism? Like, why is it such a dangerous path for people to go down?
So climate doom has overtaken climate denial in the last 5 years. Obviously, there are still people online especially who will claim they don't believe in climate change, but as we're realizing, a lot of that is trolls and bots. So the vast majority of people do believe that climate change is real. But when the shift to this climate doom started happening was honestly when a lot of developed Western nations started experiencing the worst impacts of climate change, whereas the global South, the frontline communities, have been experiencing these awful disasters for years. And the real danger was that with this is that people will give up on activism. We know we need the numbers in order to address climate change, in order to push forward climate action and justice. And when people believe it's too late, why would they fight?
Yeah, and I think, I say this one is for you, is, one of the most troubling things to me is that it kind of perpetuates this mentality of like climate change is something off in the future still. It's like, oh, our grandkids may be screwed. What are we going to do? But really, climate change is here, and it's impacting frontline communities right now, all over the globe, all over the U.S., like here in Miami Beach. So, can you talk about some of the kind of like the privilege and the disconnect that kind of undergirds this mentality too?
Yeah, I think it's super important to kind of address how the environmental movement hasn't really done a popular job in actually making those interconnections. Of course, environmental justice has really illustrated that, but I think when it comes to the future of the planet, we have to kind of admit that climate doomerism upholds white supremacist narratives, and this goes back into immigration work in which I've done, is that, a few years ago when the white supremacists came to El Paso and literally murdered many Latino immigrants, he was very influenced by the Great Replacement theory, and the Great Replacement theory is basically looking at how, in global North countries that migrants are going to replace white people. And the truth is that we need to start to be comfortable to talking about anti-racism, because I think a lot of us can say that we're pro-BLM, pro-LGBT, pro-immigrant rights, but then when it comes to actually saying what we're spreading, perhaps the language that we're saying is not intentional to hurt people, but we have to start to really reframe this narrative that this is a white supremacist issue that we are currently dealing with in our ecological crisis. Poor immigrants of color are not causing the climate crisis. It's corporations that are based in those communities of color that are literally poisoning us and then influencing, white supremacists to come to our communities and to slaughter us. So if you're uncomfortable to talk about your own whiteness and how it upholds racism, then how are you going to be advocating for climate change?
Yeah, absolutely. This one is for all three of you. I'm just wondering what you found to be some of the most effective strategies for combating climate doomerism, whether it's in like one-on-one conversations with loved ones or in a bigger scale with your online audiences.
Yeah, I would say for me, there's so many solutionists around the world, especially in the global South. And, my family's from the Philippines, and, they're on the front lines of the climate crisis. And the thing is, you don't really hear those stories, right? And, as much as we love a good susty fit or living more eco-friendly, at the end of the day, it comes down to survival, adaptation, and resilience for so many communities around the world that it's not a trendy thing, it's actually survival. And I think it doesn't really get recognized that way, that communities on the ground ground within their own context have the solutions, and it's just a matter of the need of funding, resource redistribution, and the need of power redistribution to be able to bring that funding. And we recognize that in the recent climate negotiations with COP27 with the Loss and Damage Fund, but that took my whole lifetime. I was born in 1995, and it took this long for even these little pennies for a Loss and Damage Fund. So it's like, how is the funding going to the communities on the ground that have those stories and solutions? I think that's how you combat climate doom, because you're actually seeing those resources going to those communities in the context that they need for them to implement those strategies. We don't need any more white savior, these communities need to be saved. These communities are saving themselves every single day, and they're coming up with those solutions right now. So how are we supporting them as allies on the ground and empowering them to have the voice and the agency to take up those spaces?
Yeah, I think that for a lot of us, we can know that general news media has a fatalistic approach in approaching doom and gloom. But I like to really ground my work in evidence-based hope. And to me, evidence-based hope is from my mentor, author, Ellen Kelsey, that really defines it as it's not just this rooted wishful thinking. It actually looks at the continued momentum of movements and local solutions happening on the ground. And I use this case study where I visited the Monterey Bay back in January to actually film an independent media series to actually highlight local solutions. And it was really interesting to see how she told me, hope cannot be seen sometimes. Sometimes we look at natural landscapes or we look at our own cities and all we think about, wow, gentrification, housing, risings of cost living, biodiversity loss. But then we don't really connect with local or solutions-based journalism that actually showcases, wow, there is actually on the ground work that is being done. And so I think when I work a lot with nonprofits and institutions to kind of communicate climate science, I always say, let's present local solutions, but also be realistic of what is working, what is not working, but celebrate those wins and also losses at the same time.
Absolutely. And as a scientist, I feel like all I do nowadays is scream, it's not too late. Mm-hmm. And about 2 years ago, I got a comment under one of my videos where I was screaming it was not too late, saying, well, then tell me why. Tell me why it's not too late. Sure, the science says it, but what's actually happening? Mm-hmm. So I went from talking mostly about climate issues. I think everyone in this room is well aware of how devastating climate change is and will continue to be if we don't address it. But I went into talking more about solutions and not just, oh, hey, green energy is a thing we need to do. More of how are communities on the ground, particularly in frontline communities in the global south, addressing climate change right now? And how are we scaling up these solutions all over the world? And tying in with that, calls to action for people. I think there's a lot of disconnect between we see an issue, we see a solution, but how do we as individuals play a role in this? And because of that, all I do now is uplift climate solutions from people all over the world. And that has certainly made a difference with my thinking and with my audience's thinking.
Yeah, something we hear all the time from young people at Teen Vogue is that they got involved in the climate movement out of these feelings of despair, of doom, of I need to do something, what can I do? And then they actually found it to be hugely helpful in addressing those kind of very understandable existential fears. So I think storytelling and activism and finding community are really important ways to sort of beat back these feelings. So yeah, couldn't agree more. And then, Kristy, you touched on this in your answer, this question of mitigation, because I think, I know journalists can be bad about this, but sort of framing climate as this all or nothing issue, right? And the latest IPCC report comes out and all the headlines are we have 7 years to save humanity. And that's really scary to people. And it's also not really accurate, right? Because there's gonna be billions of people on the earth in 2100. It's just a question of what is the earth gonna look like then? Yeah. So how do we sort of make sure we're emphasizing conversations around adaptability, around mitigation, around the decisions we make right now really matter, in our own communities, at the governmental level, all of that?
Yeah, we're seeing climate change happening right now. So it's not something in the far off future. We're seeing the impacts happening to communities right now, but it is a matter of degrees, right? A 1.5 degrees Celsius world is way different than a 2 degrees Celsius world, and that's about the magnitude of climate feedback loops. So, at a 1.5 degrees Celsius world, we are gonna see, extreme heating, flooding, loss of species, loss of insects. But at a 2 degrees Celsius world, we're gonna see that, 2-3 times magnitude, right? And I don't think people really realize that. They don't realize we're pretty much already on trajectory of a 1.5 degrees Celsius world, which is scary in itself. But there's still things we can do in different contexts to manage, to mitigate, to adapt to those conditions. Whereas a 2 degrees Celsius world, it's gonna be runaway climate change. There's gonna be, these feedback loops are gonna get faster, bigger magnitude, and communities are on the line. And so we have to address that communities right now, even before a 1.5 degree world, are already being impacted. What's going to happen to those communities at a 1.5 degrees Celsius world, and what could happen if we don't take action at 2 degrees. So scientists are saying every 0.1 degree matters for action. I think that gives people hope, right? It feels like something we really have agency to take action on. Because yes, maybe we're set on track towards 1.5 degrees. But if we can keep that down, keep that at a set level, it will still be devastating. Communities will be devastated. Ecosystems, we're gonna lose them, right? Species, we're gonna lose them. But at least we can mitigate those worst impacts to get us further away from the 2% cap, where it's gonna be a lot harder for us to control runaway climate change. I think we need to make sure that our adaptation strategies are contextual for communities to be able to adapt to those changes.
Mm-hmm. This is just a side note, but I'm wondering with all of you, do you find it useful to get into it with your commenters ever? If you get a real climate doomer coming on your feed, do you engage, or are you just I need to think at a higher level than just getting into it with every single person?
I block and delete them.
Okay.
At this point, I've noticed it is not worth my time and energy to debate with someone who clearly is never going to come to our side, is never going to come to the side of science. Mm-hmm. So I just block and delete and move on and try to help people who have climate anxiety or maybe are falling victim to climate doom. That's well worth my time versus ranting with somebody in my comment section.
Where do you get the sense that people are getting these climate doom, especially young people, getting these climate doomer messages from, predominantly?
Newspaper headlines. Unfortunately, there are a lot of clickbaity headlines out there, and a lot of young people love to use this green screen tool on their social media apps to just stand in front of it with some very emotive song in the background and just not add any information. They haven't read the article, it's very clear. Those go viral. And one thing leads to another, and people are like, it's too late. Because of that. But also, it's seeing how we have not taken a lot of climate action up until this point. It's very frustrating as a younger person to be like, I have been in this line of work for over 10 years. And we're just now starting to make a lot of difference. So for even younger people who have grown up only knowing climate and climate change, and seeing older generations almost, you all are doing things. I know you all are doing things. But for people on social media, it doesn't really look like it sometimes.
I think it goes back to the framing of, when we see these sometimes apolitical views or the destruction of the Arctic or biodiversity loss, you'll see the comments and people are saying, we are the issue, heartbroken emoji. And it's no, we are not the issue. Yes, we all contribute to environmental impact, but corporations and white supremacy is depleting natural resources at such a rapid rate that we are seeing these effects. And I think a lot of people get so easily to be able to say, yeah, we are the virus. And it's I really try to defeat that narrative by saying my ancestors were displaced by their own lands and, were forced to migrate in the United States for that reason. And the other thing is just being able to really understand how much what we're currently dealing with in our current politics, where critical race theory is being slammed and being banned in a lot of schools. What makes you think that when it comes to environmental justice, environmental racism right now, in East Palestine, they're blaming the EPA, saying that if they didn't focus on environmental racism, this wouldn't have happened. So, we are losing momentum at the same time gaining it in our own communities. But I do think that there needs to be able to really be stronger communicators in this movement, which is why a lot of young people here are trying to really communicate with you all. It's like, let us be in those rooms and like, let us really build those relationships, because at the end of the day, there's gonna be a point where you all are not gonna be, you know, able to walk because you get older, and we are the ones that are gonna be in those rooms. And you know, like, we need to be able to build stronger coalitions, of course, and to really build that wisdom to ensure younger generations are not easily swayed into this doomerist narrative.
Yeah, I think something that's kind of been woven through this whole conversation are these questions of individual versus collective responsibility, right? And I think something that feeds climate doomerism is this feeling of like, what can I as an individual do about this problem? It's so huge. But really, it's not like, an individual can't solve the climate crisis. Like, it has to be individuals coming together collectively to, you know, to make sure that governments and militaries and, you know, big corporations are being held accountable and taking the action they need at the scale that's required. So, yeah, I think, and that's just a more empowering way to think about it, right? Like, it's a group problem. It is not one. It's not you and your straws or whatever. So, how do you try to like reinforce that message on your platforms?
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, it's just about like, how do we build community? How do we use social media as a tool for community? I think this is the first generation where we can use these tools to be able to mobilize and meet people from around the world, from communities we've never been a part of, at like that, you know, like at a click of a button. I've met people from, you know, countries around the world that are working on climate activism in communities I would probably never have access to, or don't want to, you know, burn all the carbon to get to, you know, all those things. And it's just really exciting because like we're sharing and exchanging information at such a rapid rate. We're able to build new tools. And, you know, it's just very exciting what young people can do with social media if they use it strategically and leverage it as a way to mobilize the people around them to take action in their communities. I just think there's never been a better time for people to get involved in this fight, especially young people, because there's so much strategy that can happen. And on an intergenerational note, because, you know, I love older folks, I would say that like there's a really big opportunity in this room right now where it's like, if you're, instead of being like, oh, I'm not on social media, it's like, no, why don't I treat people like us as experts and actually partner with us, because you have the institutional knowledge, you have access to all these resources in academia and climate science, and we have access to trusted audiences of hundreds to millions of thousands of people around the world. And so it's like, how can we actually create those intentional partnerships and build together? Because that, I think, is a piece of the puzzle that's missing. It's not a young people versus old people approach. It needs to be intergenerational if we're actually going to save this thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, echoing off everything that you've been saying is that, I mean, I love having older friends. I was telling my younger friends, like, you know, that the importance of having older friends is, yes, they have mansions or houses, they're already established, you get to stay, hang out with them, they treat you really well, like a child. But, you know, I think in terms of like mentorship, like, I've been able to really ground myself even more. And I've always said that, you know, we don't think social media is the solution. We've always said it's a part of the solution. I understand as a communicator, I'm not a journalist, I'm not a CEO. Like, I always tell people clearly that, look, I want to be able to respect everyone's work title here. So how do we really build together, other than you just seeing me as an influencer that sells products? It's like, I'm much more worth than that. Like, we all have environmental science degrees, and that's always devalued in these spaces just because, you know, oh, well, you're just a young person, you probably don't know what you're doing. It's like, a lot of us have actually been in many rooms and conversations with these business leaders. So I think a lot of older people here actually just reach out to young people and see how we can actually knowledge exchange, and also maybe letting me stay at your property for a few days.
Do you want to add anything, Alaina?
I mean, listen to young people, listen to other generations, but when it comes to community building, we can't ignore different communities. We must all work together, and for us, our communities are offline, but they are also online. And like Kristy said, we have between us millions of people who follow us, and those are our community. And together, we can all work to make that community billions of people.
Yeah. And I don't know. I feel like it can be a little corny to end these kinds of events with questions about like, what gives you hope about the climate crisis? So instead, like, what do you hope people walk out of the room with today? If they came in here with one idea about climate doomerism, what should they know? Except intergenerational organizing is a good thing.
I would say take climate doom very seriously. It is clearly impacting young people, and that is who we need to get on board with climate action. They are going to be experiencing the worst impacts of it. The older generations, unfortunately, will not be around for that, but we will. And because of that, we need to address climate doom in the way that we communicate, in the way that we publish academic papers, and the way that we go about policy as well.